A glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and to pull up a chair as we gather together right here in our very favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub, and where we travel back in time. And in this installment, I have the extreme honor and privilege of welcoming you, dear listener, to Pleistocene Park. As always, wherever we are in time, joining me are James Waldo and Jason Pentrail, who showed up this evening wearing a sock puppet on one hand and practicing his American Sign Language. He is sitting there doing that right now. Apparently, we have to try and interpret what he's saying. But all kidding aside, Jason, my boy, how are you?
Hey, guys. It's good to be here once again. Hey, we got a brand new episode tonight. I'm really looking forward to this one. And we've got some big news going on, so let's get into it.
Yes, let's get into it. But first and foremost, of course, James Waldo, good to see you as always. Captain America himself right here, ladies and gents.
Yeah, I've got to wear the stars and stripes on my shirt for every podcast, in case everybody didn't know. It's good to see you again, Micah. And Jason, I appreciate the master class in sock puppet sign language tonight. That's pretty interesting. And I'm also ready for my terrifying Jeep ride through Pleistocene Park.
Yeah, that's, I think, what Jason was alluding to, because as most people by now already know, there's been big news in the world of genetic engineering. And it's very much like something you'd expect to see in a film based on a Michael Crichton novel. We haven't got dinosaurs yet, ladies and gents, but we do have dire wolves, or at least a very close approximation to that. Now, let me explain, because I have a personal connection to this story. A few weeks back, my friend Ben Lamb, who is the CEO of a company called Colossal Biosciences, reached out to me and he said, "Listen, Micah, I have an interesting news story I want to share with you. And this is going to be under embargo. The story won't be dropping until a certain day of the week, next week. But if you got time for a call later this week, I would like to show you something interesting." And so Ben and I got on a call, and I was shown imagery that now the whole world has seen. In fact, subscribers to Time magazine saw some of those images on the cover of said publication. And when I saw this, I was thinking to myself, boy, this is incredible, and I think it's a unique time for us to be alive. But even beyond that, the fact that Colossal Biosciences has effectively brought back something very close to the dire wolf is very important to the work we do here at Seven Ages, because in addition to our study of the ancient human presence in the Americas and also just ancient traditions and archaeology from around the world, paleoanthropology, which we'll also be discussing a bit, and paleontology. When it comes to ancient humans, Paleoindian, American hunters, the kinds of fauna, many of them megafauna, that were hunted right here in North America, but since those times have been long extinct. And so for thousands of years, we have wondered about what life in America would have been like based on the kinds of fossil reconstructions we see. I remember Jason and I were wandering through a museum one time, and they had the reconstructed fossil remains of a giant ground sloth. And I'm looking at that monster, and I'm thinking to myself, man, if I had been alive in the Pleistocene era and I had walked alongside animals like that, I mean, it would have been really something else. It would have been scary as hell, too. Now, the dire wolf, of course, is a rather ominous and imposing-sounding creature, because when you add to wolf things like megafaunal, apex predator, North American giant wolf, these kinds of ideas, it really changes your perspective on the kinds of things that ancient Americans faced in their day-to-day lives. Add to that, of course, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bear, gomphotheres. God, you ever looked at a gomphothere? or at least a picture of what they're supposed to look like. If you haven't, you really should look them up. Yeah, I mean, life was really strange back in those times. But we never really thought beyond the fossil record and beyond maybe CGI reconstructions and things that we see in these museums that we would ever really get a good look at what one of these animals would actually resemble. Well, that's all changing now because thanks to the folks at Colossal Biosciences who launched that company with this idea, hey, we're going to bring back the mammoth. But we're also looking at other potential candidates for de-extinction, the dodo, the thylacine, and others. They hadn't even mentioned anything publicly about the dire wolf. But apparently, as this comes to pass, they were able to extract genetic samples from a couple of different well-preserved samples of the dire wolf. Now, that DNA was not directly used, i.e. there wasn't harvestable DNA that could be injected into a living cell and then placed into a surrogate mother, and then actual dire wolves drawing from the real, true, ancient genetic lineage. That's not how they created these dire wolves. What they did was they were able to create the most complete sequencing of the dire wolf genome based on those well-preserved samples that's ever been achieved. And then using that sequenced genome, they were able to replicate using CRISPR gene editing technology, modern gray wolf DNA, and then a domestic dog was used as a surrogate mother. But lo and behold, the end result was indeed a wolf species that is larger than modern wolves. It has a number of different morphological characteristics that are very different from your typical gray wolf or red wolves or other extant wolf species. In other words, it is a very close approximation of the long-extinct dire wolf. And, of course, they are currently still working on trying to revive the mammoth and other aforementioned extinction, well, now candidates for de-extinction, but presently extinct species. So this is pretty remarkable. James, what did you think about that when you saw the dire wolves in the news?
Well, I thought it was pretty amazing. And, looking at the animals that they created, they're definitely not gray wolves or red wolves. They don't really resemble any type of wolf that I think I'm familiar with. So it certainly has got, I mean, what else have you got, right? It has to look like what a dire wolf probably looked like.
Yeah, now there are some purists who have said, yeah, but guys, this is not really dire wolf DNA that was used. They were using genetic engineering to replicate that, and so we haven't really brought back the dire wolf. And although that's a fair point, I think, and again, Ben Lamb has been all over social media saying a lot of people, I think, had a misunderstanding of what we had intended to do when we said we were going to create de-extinction technology. It may not be practical or realistic to actually do what happened in Jurassic Park, where we drill into insects that have dino DNA preserved in amber for millions of years, extract that, and then bring back long-extinct species. Other funny thing, too, is I'm seeing people already online saying, please bring back a dinosaur next. And I'm thinking, again, if you only knew how hard it was to get quality DNA from species that have been dead for a few thousand years, try 65 million years, it's almost impossible. No, I'm saying it probably is impossible. I don't think there's any chance they'd actually be able to do that. And maybe we're all the better for that. But again, really, with what we are doing, what they actually mean by de-extinction technology, again, it's giving us the closest approximation that human eyes in our lifetimes will ever see, and which really any human has seen in at least more than 9,500 years. I think Colossal says about 12,500, but again, there are some dire wolf remains that are believed to have been dated to about 9,500 years ago, and also some disputed examples that made their way possibly over into China, which is an interesting discussion all in itself, the idea of megafaunal species going back and forth across the Bering Strait, right? So maybe another conversation we could have at another time. But anyway, so that's the big news about the dire wolf, and we're just very fascinated with this. And again, I felt pretty privileged to have had that direct connection and was one of the people who actually got to see these before the big story broke.
So, we were talking about how it would feel to live in the Pleistocene if you really put yourself in that position, to what, how the people lived, especially in North America during that time. You're long before the invention of gunpowder or ballistics or firearms of any kind. So can you imagine having to defend yourself with primitive weapons against all of these beasts that were roaming the land?
I would suspect that there's a really good reason why Paleoindian lithic technologies look the way they do compared to archaic North American lithic technologies. I mean, you look at the mastery that they had of stone, and again, the Clovis spear points, those are masterful in direct proportion to the efficacy required in defending against and actually hunting and killing for food these large land mammals. I'm sure it was a really interesting time to be alive, but here's an interesting thing too to take into consideration. So we might say that on the nearer side of potential windows for extinction, the dire wolf could have been around as recently as 9,500 years ago. Another intriguing possibility is that there may have been other kinds of hominins that walked the earth around as recently as when the last dire wolves were here. Case in point, back in 2015, there were some fishermen in Taiwan who were out there in a bay, and I believe they were dredging with nets. There are actually a lot of fossils that are found this way because, keep in mind, the seafloor of today was at one time often the coastline of Pleistocene North America and other parts of the world. With the accumulation of ice at the poles, sea levels were lower, and therefore our coastlines extended further out. And so land animals and even humans that would have hunted along those coastlines or fished, often fossils do turn up that are completely covered by seawater now, but indeed those were ancient areas that were once exposed. And so these fishermen in Taiwan, they pull up a curious fossil. It is indeed some kind of a hominin jaw. And initially one would think maybe that's a Neanderthal. Wow, once in a lifetime find, you find a portion of a Neanderthal jawbone. Problem is, they look at the morphology and they look at the likely period in which this fossil is believed to have hailed from. And although they couldn't get an exact date, they did determine two things. A, it's not Neanderthal, and whatever this thing was existed between 19,000 and about 10,000 years ago. Now, the last of the Neanderthals that we expect to have been around were in the Iberian Peninsula, and that, in the neighborhood of about 50,000 years ago when they died out. So what was walking around in modern-day Taiwan along a beach 10,000 years ago, potentially, that looked kind of human, but really more on the Neanderthal side, if anything, actually possessing even more robust hominin characteristics than the Neanderthal is known to have? Well, it's been a mystery for a long time. But now we know, in fact, that this mysterious jaw fragment known as Penghu 1, and you guys know I've been fascinated by this for years, Penghu 1 has now been determined to be a Denisovan. We now have seen an actual, almost complete mandible of a Denisovan, and this not only shows us that they looked quite a bit different from humans and from Neanderthals, but also they might have been lurking around as recently as some of the last dire wolves, which is, to me, absolutely extraordinary for a whole lot of different reasons, and way too many than we have time to get into right now.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And honestly, I think that all of those, the hominid species and the dire wolf and a lot of the Pleistocene animals are much closer to us in time than what the fossil record actually shows, because what we're really talking about is it's the most recent fossil that we've found. But that does not necessarily mean that that's not the end-all, be-all of the entire thing.
Well, to that point, if you look at how long it takes for fossil formation to occur, really, under the right circumstances, it can happen relatively quickly. And in lab conditions, I think within maybe just a couple of weeks. But, the actual definition of fossil usually is 10,000 years or older. Okay? And I'm looking at the new determinations that have been made, yet again, thanks to advancements in genetic science about Penghu 1, and I'm saying, okay, so there were Denisovans in Southeast Asia, maybe as recently as 10,000 years ago. Now, keep in mind, the paper about this says a Pleistocene hominin, so they are probably going with that much earlier estimate of 19,000 years. But again, if we were to presume that as recently as 10,000 years ago we might have fossil evidence of Denisovans, and 10,000 years is generally the kind of benchmark for fossil formation, I think it stands to reason there's probably a good chance there could have been Denisovans a little nearer to the modern era than just 10,000 years ago, and that one fossil that we found, knowing how rare Denisovan fossils are, that one fossil is probably a poor representation of the extent to which and the periods during which they might have thrived. Further add to that the fact that, you look at all the human populations that have DNA from Denisovans in them, right? Genetic science shows that there must have been enough Denisovans getting around to have contributed to that admixture, and of course modern populations still carry that genetic information within them. And yet there is so little in the fossil record. So yet again, logic would have to dictate that there are far fewer fossil examples than there were living examples, because the genetic evidence clearly shows there were plenty of Denisovans around. Now think about that. Yet again, if we base our presumptions about how recently those species might have existed off of the fossils, we could be way off. And the intriguing possibility of Denisovans having been around until far more recently than, our expectations might indicate, that's a fascinating prospect, if you ask me.
Yeah, it certainly is. And, one thing to consider is, that DNA that exists from those extinct species that exists in modern humans today sort of makes us a living fossil record.
That's a really interesting way to put it, James. Well, anyway, we'll have these stories linked in the show notes as always. Right now, it's about time for us to get into our conversation for this week. I do want to remind everybody, head over there and check us out on Patreon. Check us out on social media. We have our Facebook group, the 7 Ages Research Associates. You can keep up with all of our latest research and all of the ongoing discussion over there on Facebook. And, of course, follow all of our other material there at 7ages.org. But, Jason, let's get into this main conversation. What have you got in store for us tonight?
Tonight, we're going to be welcoming to the show Dr. Morgan Smith. We're going to be talking about the Ryan-Harley site, which is very similar in a lot of ways to the Page-Ladson site. So we're going to be, again, going back to that late Pleistocene, early Holocene time period, talking about the Suwannee, which is a very unique group that doesn't get as much attention as some of the other paleo groups that are mentioned here on the show. So it should be a great episode.
I love talking about that area of archaeology, that period, of course, in archaeology. And, of course, with our fondness for the Page-Ladson site and the archaeologists who've worked there. So we're going to dive back into things and go back in time yet again, an actual glimpse at the archaeology of the Pleistocene when we return here in a moment, right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Tonight on the 7 Ages Audio Journal, we welcome Dr. Morgan Smith to the show. Dr. Smith received his PhD in anthropology from Texas A&M University, where he studied in the Center for the Study of the First Americans. Prior to this, he worked for the Southeast Archaeological Center of the National Park Service. He has over a decade of experience in underwater and terrestrial archaeology. His contributions to underwater archaeology include efforts to develop methods and models to accurately and reliably locate underwater prehistoric sites, emphasizing mobile forager societies. He has conducted archaeological and anthropological research throughout the Southeast and in Missouri, Texas, Nevada, Mexico, and Costa Rica, and is coming to us tonight from the beautiful country of Spain. Dr. Morgan Smith, welcome to the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thanks, Jason. Great to be here.
Well, you're one of those guests that we've had on the list for so long. I've been following your work for a long time. You've had so many great contributions in your career already, great papers, lots of wonderful research. So we are truly happy to finally get you here on the show. And even though you're coming to us from another continent right now, it's all good. And so before we get into the conversation tonight, tell us a little bit about what you have going over there in Spain right now. What are you working on?
Yeah, at the moment, I'm working at the University of Alcalá, which is just east of Madrid, and I'm teaching a class on kind of comparing and contrasting underwater archaeological policy in Spain and the United States. So the city that we're in is actually the first planned university city in Europe. So it's on the UNESCO World Heritage Site. That's its kind of claim to fame, as well as it's the hometown of Cervantes, of Don Quixote fame. So it's a super literary, super interesting place. And I thought it would be a good backdrop to kind of examine UNESCO and specifically how it deals with underwater cultural patrimony, kind of on the heels of about a 20-year retrospective now on its International Convention on Underwater Cultural Heritage.
All right. So what you're saying is you're very busy with some very detailed work there in Spain, it sounds like.
Most definitely. Yeah, it's lots no wine or olives or delicious tapas involved at all.
All right. Well, we got to make sure you find time to fit that stuff in there. It's a must. But again, Spain, beautiful country. Love that area of the world. So we're here tonight to talk about the Ryan-Harley site. Now, listeners to the show may remember we have quite an affinity for Florida archaeology. It's such an interesting place, especially for those early paleo sites. We've had, guests in the past like Jesse Halligan, Jim Dunbar, a lot of different people on the show over the time, really focusing in on this area. But again, the Ryan-Harley site is one that we haven't had an opportunity to really delve into the details, and that's what we're going to do here tonight. So, Morgan, before we get into the specifics of the site, again, let's revisit for the listeners who maybe haven't heard that Paige Ladson show. Talk about that area of the Panhandle of Florida, the topography and the river systems. They're very, very unique to that part of the country and not really something you see in a whole lot of places. So let's begin there.
Totally. Yeah, I'm a fan of the show, so I've heard the Jim Dunbar and Andy Hemmings talk and the Dr. Halligan talk, and they both do an awesome job of kind of explaining the bedrock geology that makes this area so unique. I mean, essentially what we're dealing with is a really deep karst plateau that's minimally overlain by sediment in most of the places that we're looking at. I mean, the majority of the area is surface bedrock, maybe a meter or so of sand on top of it. Of course, there's deeper stratigraphy elsewhere, but this karst plateau is dissected in a series of low gradient, slow moving river systems that are typically spring fed or drainage fed from pretty wide catchment areas. So, I mean, ultimately, we're kind of in a similar analogous environment of some other areas in the South. Like, for example, the Tennessee River Valley is also a karstic drainage. But what makes Florida a little bit unique is just the low gradient. So the rivers are much more sluggish. They're less conducive to this kind of widespread flooding that you see elsewhere. That can be a really destructive process, and it can strip away sedimentation pretty quickly. And they also tend to have somewhat wide river valleys, which means that the channels can move and migrate and kind of slither their way through the area. So if they encounter an obstacle, it's not uncommon for a river channel to anastomose and just jump into another area. So there's not really a really defined channel that all this water is flooding through all the time. It's a relatively wide, low, flat area, which means that if a site's occupied and preservation environment is there, the river's not always kind of full bore eroding most of the areas. Sometimes there's natural traps, almost like a grease trap in a sink, where sediment's really easy to accumulate down in these areas. So overall, also the temperature environment's really stable. We like stability for preservation, and it doesn't necessarily matter what the stable environment is, if it's super cold or super hot or super wet, but fortunately for us in Florida, it's super wet all the time and it's relatively temperature regulated. So yeah, all these things kind of really stack up in our favor to be able to host probably the largest concentration of intact late Pleistocene, early Holocene sediment sequences outside of maybe the San Pedro Valley in Arizona.
Yeah, it is a truly remarkable area, and one I hope to get down to and see in person sometime. Again, I've just seen, the photographs and the reports from the area, but it looks very, very intriguing. The way that those systems meander in such a slow fashion, from an archaeological standpoint, do you think that's more beneficial, or does it make it more difficult to kind of track in the past where the river systems may have been, or positions or settlements or encampments may have been?
Yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword for sure. I mean, I'm sure for every site that we can see, there's so many that we can't see. Ryan-Harley's a really good example of that. The Osceola River is slightly different. The Osceola River course is largely defined by a series of sinkholes dotted up and down a primary drainage. And when the Osceola floods, it floods outwards, but there is still a channel that's more or less dictated by these sinkholes. The Wassissa River, where the Ryan-Harley is, which actually feeds into the Osceola River, and actually, if it weren't for the Wassissa River, Paige Ladson wouldn't exist, because what's happening is the Paige Ladson site is right where the Osceola and Wassissa come together. And the flow of the Wassissa actually is running into the flow of the oscilla in such a way that it pushes the current of the oscilla away from the intact sediment sequence that's preserved at Page Ladson. So the Wassissa actually creates an eddy that the sediment is protected by. So it's in this eddy environment. I heard Jim and Andy and Jesse kind of talking about the channel lag down at the bottom of the oscilla. That's pretty much what Page Ladson would look like if it weren't for the Wassissa. So yeah, the Wassissa is quite a bit different, where it's not really sinkhole dictated. There's a series of first magnitude large freshwater springs coming out of the bedrock there at the headwaters. But for many kilometers until Ryan-Harley, it's pretty much just a vast hydric swamp with sand and sediment kind of capping this late Pleistocene surface. So yeah, I'm sure that for every site we can see, there are so many more that we can't see. And that's kind of the exciting nature of the Wassissa is, I was actually just at Ryan-Harley a couple of weeks ago just to kind of check up on it. And several trees had fallen, and it's clear that the course of the river's changing. And it might move itself away from Ryan-Harley. And we'll get into this later, but the river erosion is part of why Ryan-Harley is found. So that might move away from Ryan-Harley, but that in doing so, that might expose another series of sites that we haven't seen yet.
Yeah, the whole method and the whole system of that natural erosion there is really, really interesting. And one reason I love discussing this area so much, because it's unique in the world, in the country for sure. Now, you mentioned the site, Ryan-Harley site. So this was discovered. Let's talk a little bit about Ryan and Harley means. These are the gentlemen who are credited with discovering this site, and a little bit about how it was found and what were the initial indicators that there was actually a paleo site there.
So the Meanses are definitely kind of like, a first family of Florida archaeology, particularly as it comes to underwater sites. So their father, Bruce Means, who's a internationally renowned herpetologist and ecologist, both got them started river diving very early. Bruce kind of pioneered the many areas of the oscilla, including Sloth Hole. And these stories are kind of insane, where they would just be going down there with no flashlights or anything, just immersing themselves in this deep, dark water. I heard Jim refer to it as diving in dark roast coffee. That's pretty accurate, So going down there without a light is kind of wild. There's all sorts of crappy limestone, and there's fishing lures, and there's all kinds of stuff that you could get caught up on. But Bruce just kind of still talks about it to this day as this like marvelous thing where, he's kind of reaching around down there, and he's one of the first people to really be down there, and they were just finding all these marvelous fossils and artifacts. And that's what kind of really clued them into this. So Ryan and Harley and their father, Bruce, they're all scientists. So that's what makes them such a great resource to rely on and to draw on in this study. Ryan's an ecologist, Harley's a geologist, state geologist of Florida. So when they find something, it can be taken with much more credence than your average kind of, individual. And they really know what they're talking about. They really understand the history and geology and the ecology of archaeology of Florida. And as I understand it, they were just kind of diving down in the river. And this was, nowadays, it's not legal to just go diving in the river for artifacts. And this is a kind of long and controversial thing in the state of Florida. But they were operating under an era there where it was permitted to do so, provided you reported your finds. And from what I recall, they found one of the primary projectile points that's kind of like the iconic point from Ryan-Harley. It's this beautiful long lanceolate Suwannee point with only a tiny bit of one of the basal ears missing. That was like the first artifact that clued them into it. So, and they went back to the site several times, and they found another diagnostic. And at that point, they brought in the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research, thinking that, hey, this could be what people have kind of been looking for, which was a discrete Suwannee site where there was only Suwannee material and nothing else.
Yeah, and we're going to get into all the details of that. It's very exciting. Again, something so rare and unusual. So I believe this was 1994 that the site was discovered, if I remember correctly. And then we see our previous guest, Jim Dunbar, come in and begin to work on the site. So talk a little bit about how Jim ended up there and what was his involvement with the site.
So at the time, Jim was working for the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research. And Jim obviously is a quite famous archaeologist in the state of Florida. He's seen more Paleoindian archaeology than probably anybody. And he immediately kind of recognized the potential of this site because Suwannee and Simpson, particularly these unfluted lanceolate points in the southeast, and there's other varieties. We have a pretty good grip on Clovis from several other sites in the southeast, but our knowledge really drops off super quickly when we talk about kind of what's in between Clovis or early Paleoindian sites and the late Paleoindian sites. So the middle Paleoindian is really not well understood at all, and that probably has answers in geology. We're talking about kind of the height of the Younger Dryas. So we're talking about a time period that's quite different climatologically. There's probably not as much sediment input. There's probably people adapting to a climatic shift. So they might be taking on different decision-making strategies that would dictate where they're using the site differently. But Jim immediately kind of recognized the potential for the site. And they went out there, I believe, in 1998. And I think they went out several times before that. But the focus of their excavations were looking at an intact sediment sequence of a component of the site to try to determine whether or not the Suwannee material was intact and was in fact a kind of discrete deposit.
Yeah, so again, bringing that, that extra firepower in for documentation, for really getting into the specifics of the site. Obviously, it ended up being a very significant site. Once Jim got in there and began to examine the site in more detail, along with the initial find made by the Means brothers, what was Jim able to add to the discovery list as far as his own personal discoveries?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned that the Means were diving on the site, and they were working under a permitting process where you weren't allowed to like excavate the site or anything like that, but it was called the Isolated Finds Program. And so the idea was if you found an isolated artifact, you could report it to the state. And when they first found the first Suwannee point, that counts as an isolated artifact, right? But when you find two, that's no longer by definition an isolated artifact. So that's when they kind of were like, oh my gosh, okay, maybe this material is eroding out of context, and they got Jim involved. And Jim headed out there, and I think he first probably went out there in 96 or 97 just to kind of assess the site. In 98, they opened some of the first test units at the site, and they did it pretty close to where the diagnostic artifact was found. And what they found was just basically a deflated surface with, all the material just kind of in a channel lag kind of deposit. So there wasn't really much to write home about. But they were so enthusiastic about what had been found that they thought it was worth one more go. And in 1999, they opened 7 test units a little bit downstream from where they did the 98 tests. And in doing so, they kind of caught, again, like a little eddy, almost like current, so similar to Page Ladson, where there's a very large cypress tree that's kind of the guardian of the site almost. And a lot of the intact material is just downstream of that cypress tree, which acts as kind of a natural barrier for the erosion of the site. And what they did was they kind of slowly worked towards the bank. And some of their first units just kind of yielded the same data as the 98 units, where the material was just all on the surface. But as they got closer to the riverbank, they started identifying more and more stratigraphy and realized that there was an intact sequence closer to the riverbank. So this resulted in, 2 of their 7 units found a fully intact set sequence. So the other 5, it was kind of partially there and intermixed here and there. But they identified 2 areas where it was fully intact. And in these 2 areas, they found, several hundred faunal specimens. They found lots of diagnostic material that tends to line up with the late Pleistocene, early Holocene. So unifacial scrapers and things that kind of a base from a projectile point that would later actually be refit from a piece found in situ in a different area of the riverbank. So that kind of demonstrated that this was an active eroding environment. And some of the main things that they identified that made the site super significant was, the first was that they found Pleistocene fauna remains in the same geologic context as the Suwannee material. And that's really significant because since we don't really technically know the age of Suwannee, we have some assumed ages and there's still some debate on it. But it was kind of this interesting debate where any way you cut it, that either meant that, if you assume Pleistocene fauna die out as we expect them around 13,100 years ago, then that means that if there's Suwannee material with the megafauna material, then the Suwannee material must be really early, maybe even contemporary or predating Clovis. Or the flip side of that was that megafauna live longer into the Younger Dryas than we know. So, or something else entirely that we really didn't understand. So either option was like a good contribution to understanding the prehistory of Florida. On top of that, what was really unique about it was quite a clear faunal component that represented diet. So it was pretty clear that this was a midden site that included a lot of discarded remains from foodstuffs. So lots of items together that didn't really indicate a natural deposit. So there was megafauna, there was microfauna, there were terrestrial species, there were riverine species, and kind of everything in between. Some of the items are burned, some of them bear cut marks. So pretty clear that we had the first crack at a Paleoindian diet source. And then to top it all off, 2 stone beads were found in the original excavation. So our excavation since identified an additional 2 stone beads, which makes that some of the earliest Paleoindian artwork, known in the Southeast and in North America. So it's a really compelling site for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I would say so. It's so much that comes out of just such a small area that can literally rewrite everything that we think we know, and we're seeing so much of that in Paleo-Indian research right now in North America. But before we get into more of the details of this site, let's back up for just a minute and learn a little bit more about your path to underwater archaeology. So, Morgan, what is it about underwater archaeology specifically? Now, I mean, I know you do other types as well, but what is your attraction to that particular type of archaeology? And discuss a few of the differences, if you will, or challenges versus terrestrial archaeology.
Sure. So I grew up in North Florida, actually about 30 minutes from Ryan-Harley. So the Wassis River and the Osceola River were kind of like my playground. And I started diving from a super young age. And the common pastime as a youth in Florida, was to just go to your local swimming pool and hang out, and especially kind of in the rural area of East Tallahassee that I grew up in. So from an early age, I was just like really fascinated with these karst windows that were literal like portals to the past. I mean, you could quite easily tell, there's a cave system down there that implies deep geology. What else is down there? There's fossils. You're kind of always seeing artifacts. Anybody who's been in a spring basin in Florida knows that there's, chipping material and ceramics and artifacts all over. And, that's mirrored today. Everybody still hangs out at freshwater sources, and it's a nice place to cool off in the summer. So I got really interested in underwater archaeology, just kind of having the advantage of having this wonderful resource in my backyard. And I headed over to the University of West Florida in Pensacola, where I studied under some awesome faculty there who kind of showed me a little bit more about the method and the practical side of underwater archaeology. And that was very oriented on shipwreck archaeology. But I always kind of had this lingering interest in submerged prehistory. And I guess 3 of the main mentors that I had early on were Jim Dunbar and Jesse Halligan and Mike Fott, as well as Michael Waters, who kind of steered me in that direction of adding this extra layer of, kind of paleo-environmental reconstruction. And as a native Floridian, just understanding how Florida has changed is super interesting. I mean, it's gone through a really dramatic cycle of hot and cold and wet and dry and sea level up and down. So it's just a fascinating thing. And when I was looking around I matriculated into graduate school at Texas A&M by actually my dad works in Monticello, Florida, which is where the Osceola Research Institute is headquartered, or worked there for quite some time. And he saw an ad in the local newspaper about Page Ladson being excavated by this guy, Jim Dunbar, and this guy, Mike Waters, and this woman, Jessie Halligan. And there was an email address at the bottom to Jim. And I just blindly sent an email to Jim. And I was like, hey, I'm local and I'm not really doing anything this summer. Would you mind if I just come down and hang out with you guys? And I think I was 19 at the time. And he's like, sure, come on out anytime you want. So that's what got me into underwater archaeology. And I still tell my students that to this day, that it's like, never underestimate the power of like a cold email when the timing's right and you're able to kind of back up what you say. With regard to getting involved in Ryan-Harley, I was kind of looking around for a dissertation topic. And at the time, the Page Ladson excavations were going on really strongly. And that was super fascinating. But both Jessie and Mike Waters were kind of interested in understanding some of the other sites in the area, because, the reality is when we're looking at this kind of deeper time depth, we're probably looking at a similar group of people. So the people at Ryan-Harley are most likely, maybe a handful of generations or a half dozen or so generations removed from whoever was at Page Ladson. So there can't be that many people on the landscape at the time. So just kind of understanding how the area was more widely used in prehistory. And for all the reasons that I just mentioned, Ryan-Harley was just kind of a slam dunk. It was like a known archaeological site where no matter what I found, it was going to be kind of an interesting conversation. And that's what made it really compelling to study, because it could address all these compelling questions. And yeah, it was kind of a no-lose scenario.
Yeah, again, that's why I wanted to include that, Morgan. I thought it was such an interesting way to, really find yourself involved in a really meaningful way. I did very similar things. I volunteered at the beginning and just, can I work on this excavation? What can you teach me? What can you show me? And, you build your network, and before you know it, there you are, So a few years down the road, you've got your own research going on. So you now have some of the Ryan-Harley story under your belt. You've been you've grown up in the region. You've now seen the site. You've been working with Jim. Let's talk a little bit about why you felt it was important in your research of the site to kind of retrace the steps of Jim Dunbar and also introduce us to Charles Hoffman. And why is it that you felt it was so important to the story to kind of go back and see where they had gone with your research?
I mean, there was a pretty compelling case in revisiting some of this early work just in Page Ladson, right, already. So Jim Dunbar and David Webb and Michael Fott and many other colleagues had done an excellent job in excavating Page Ladson. But it may be just out of a lack of maybe some absolute concrete in situ artifacts, hadn't been able to successfully sell the site as a pre-clovis site at the time. And a lot of that has to do with timing and kind of dogma of what accepted. So, Page Ladson the excavations kicked back off at a time when things were a lot more, academic persuasion was a lot more open to, this idea of earlier sites. And so that was pretty clearly demonstrated at Page Ladson that through more precise geoarchaeological excavation, where really the singular goal was find artifacts in situ, and document exactly where they are and radiocarbon date that exact event. That was the goal. And then that goal was incredibly successful. Knowing that, we started to kind of, me, Jessie, and Mike Waters started to think, what else is out there that maybe was discarded a little bit too soon, or wasn't discarded too soon. Maybe it was just, the stage was set for further excavation. And I think those are kind of two things where, you bring up Charles Hoffman. That was definitely an example of discarded. So that's kind of the other site that I work on for my dissertation. So Charles Hoffman excavated the Guest Mammoth site in 1973. This was actually the first submerged indigenous site excavated in the Americas. And it was super pioneering at the time. And it was very far ahead of where the status quo was. I mean, this is way before Page Ladson. This is, we're still talking about people getting into the Southeast at 8,000 years old, like maybe 9,000, like that's pushing it. So all of a sudden, this little team of archaeologists from University of Florida and Northern Arizona University find artifacts associated with a mammoth in the Silver River, Central Florida. And there's some pretty compelling older radiocarbon ages, although there's some kind of classic pitfalls with early radiocarbon ages that the excavators at the time knew nothing about. But they clearly demonstrated that there were artifacts at least physically associated with the mammoth. And that was like completely unacceptable to the archaeological establishment at the time. I mean, it was Hoffman actually went to go present his work at the Society for American Archaeology meeting the next year. They were really excited about it. And he was given an 11 p.m. time slot on a Friday night. 11 p.m. I mean, it's just like brutal on Friday night when everybody's out and about and like, catching up and talking with each other. So,
right.
And yeah, because of this reason, like this site just kind of slipped into the black hole of could be's and interesting little question marks. So that was a reason that I went back to the Guest Mammoth site. And, in kind of a different vein, the reason I went back to Ryan-Harley was because Ryan-Harley really wasn't super contentious, but like I said, the table had been set really well. The foundation had been laid to, I knew where Jim had excavated. I knew where the intact deposits were, and I knew that there was a chance of answering some really interesting questions. So both of these things kind of combined to, build on the shoulders of previous excavations and take advantage of, technological advancement in the last 30 or 40 years. To be able to apply new methods. We were able to get more improved ages on the Guest Mammoth site. We were able to apply some geoarchaeological techniques to the Ryan-Harley site that weren't possible in the 99 excavations. So yeah, it was a really good example of how archaeology really can be a science, depending on how you approach it. Like for the most part, we came to the same conclusions as Jim and Hoffman did for both of those, just with a little bit of tweaks here and there on the specifics because of more improved methodology.
Morgan, speaking of that methodology, we have discussed some of the contextual issues with underwater archaeology. We've talked about that with Dr. Halligan and also Dr. Ashley Lemke and others as well. I just want to get your thoughts on this before we move on with the site. Underwater archaeology, like most things in the world of archaeology, it's newer, therefore it's controversial. It hasn't been as refined as some people would say that they want it to be. But really, the approach to underwater archaeology is in many ways just as detail-oriented as you would see in any other excavation. So I just want to give you this opportunity to speak on the accuracy and how you go about underwater archaeology for those skeptical folks out there who may not really understand how detailed this can really be.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely excavated on land and underwater, and I think that the underwater environment provides some really ideal excavation conditions. And the underwater excavations that I've been on have been more precise overall than the terrestrial excavations because I think you're just like so much closer into the process. I mean, when you're in super dark water and your face is like 3 inches from the sediment that you're excavating, and you're not kind of leaning back, you're really closer you look, the more you see kind of scenario. So you're paying so much more attention to subtle changes in stratigraphy, and you're so much more likely to find a teeny tiny little artifact. I mean, the artifacts that were found in situ at Page Ladson, they're not really all that large. At Ryan-Harley, we piece plotted all material that was larger than a dime, so there were individual percussion flakes that several people have kind of remarked like that would just go into the screen on a terrestrial site, but we piece plotted all of that material because, I think also part of looking through water kind of magnifies things to begin with. So you kind of have this natural magnification effect and you're so much closer to it. You see things in a very different way. But yeah, I think it's a funny thing with the skepticism of some of this stuff. I think it's a bit odd that, like if we were excavating underwater sites that were 4,000, 3,000 years old, nobody would pay any attention to nobody would have a problem with that. It's the moment you throw 5 digits into an age that things become really contentious. So I think that's an interesting problem. And I mean, the issue that we're faced with here is that there's this kind of fundamental misunderstanding that these are terrestrial sites. They are simply underwater, so they're analogous to, in my area of the world now, and in the Tennessee River Valley, all of those sites were inundated by the Tennessee River, right? So they're still there. They're still preserved in actually quite remarkable condition. So famous sites like Hiwassee Island and Dallas, they're still there. I mean, those mounds are still present. You can occasionally see them poking out of the water at low water level. So we're really talking about land that's just been submerged. And if you believe in sea level rise and climate change, you kind of have to believe in the fact that there's submerged terrestrial lands. And I think there's definitely been too much of a blanket statement that these are destroyed contexts. Certainly, the inundation of a site is inherently more destructive than just a terrestrial site that sits out in the same condition, because wet dry cycles are not good, for the preservation of material. But when the conditions are right, the preservation is on par with anything else there in North America. I mean, right up next to remarkable southeastern rock shelters or desert Great Basin sites in the American West. I mean, preservation really is that good.
Yeah, so many great points there. I think you really drove home some of the closeness of the archaeology. I really like how you described that. Again, you're right there on it. You really can't get any closer, and therefore you're able to really hone in on those details. And I find that whole approach to underwater archaeology to be very, very interesting. Let's fast forward a little bit up to 2015 through 17. Now, this is your excavation with Mike Waters. Again, we're continuing this story of the Ryan-Harley site, but now you have really got a lot involved with it. You are really focused on the excavation in the site. So let's talk about those 2015 through 17 excavations, just some of the highlights of the discoveries and your thoughts on your experience from it.
Yeah. I mean, I was really fortunate to, a lot of stuff is timing, right? So I was really fortunate to kind of be coming of age at this point in time, and going through my undergraduate studies, still being kind of a malleable student, right when this fantastic project is happening right down the road for me. So yeah, I was lucky enough in 2015 to be able to initiate excavations on the site. So we established camp down there on the lower Wassissa River, and we camped out there in the Florida heat for a month, and we basically lived on site. And we opened up, I think, 9 excavation units in total, but or 9 areas of intact sediment. We had an 8x2 meter grid, but a lot of it was eroding away in the interim between when Dunbar had been out there and when I was. And our overall goal was to expose as much of the Suwannee component as possible, to try to get in super detailed geoarchaeological data on the lithic material and the faunal material. So we really wanted to try to tease out the relationship between the megafauna and the Ryan-Harley lithic material, the Suwannee material. We had hoped that we would be able to, with 20 years passing of radiocarbon dating, be able to get some more precise ages on some of the bones. And we weren't able to do that, unfortunately. So that's a project for a future archaeologist. I'm sure there is, Tom Stafford did find some nitrogen in the bones, just too small to be able to date. So it is very possible to be able to go back there in the future as things progress. But we excavated in 8x2 meter grid and 1x1s. We excavated in 5 centimeter levels. Like I said, everything that was basically pinky nail size or larger was piece plotted. And in addition to that, we collected dip and strike data on everything that we found. So we really wanted to understand whether or not, one of the critiques of the site was that the material had been subsequently reworked by riverine activity, or maybe that maybe we'd be able to parse out some characteristic differences between riverine fauna species and terrestrial fauna species. So maybe they had been deposited at different times or had been washed in. And we proceeded over the course of that month to excavate, I think, close to 3,000 or 4,000 artifacts in total, so including 2,500 piece-plotted specimens. And in 2017, Jesse Halligan returned to the site as part of a field school with Florida State University, and I was also present, and they opened up a 3 meter squared area to kind of expand some areas that we had left open and kind of tidy up the excavation block and put a bow on it. And they added about 400 more piece-plotted specimens in the same manner that we had excavated. And basically that was kind of the result of the excavation, was a nice geoarchaeological data set that we took micromorphological samples from the sediment column to get an idea of the relationship between some of the stratigraphic horizons. And we were able to obtain some more OSL ages. So OSL was attempted early on, and I think the ages actually came back kind of roughly aligned with what we reported, but they were never reported because I think there was an assumption that they were erroneous because they came back very old, out of the alignment with the expectation of maybe what the Suwannee material was. And in addition to that, we had probably half a dozen sediment cores that we used to take all sorts of samples from. Particle size analysis and loss on ignition studies were done. And then kind of the final study that we did was reconstructing the late Pleistocene landscape at the site. So we did a series of auger tests all over the landform at Ryan-Harley, where we basically stuck an auger, in at even intervals across the landscape. So this ended up being 750 auger tests over several acres to build a high resolution kind of paleo DEM, that digital elevation model, where we could strip away, if you go out to the Wasissa today, much of the area is a hydric swamp, and it's just kind of flat and featureless looking. Any rise in the river is kind of important nowadays, where it's probably betraying the presence of some rock or something, but it's pretty flat. So we wanted to we knew that probably wasn't the case when it was inhabited, and we wanted to scrape away those later deposits and get an idea of what was actually below the surface to re-envision the paleo landscape a little bit.
It's also fascinating in the effort and the time and the detail that's been put into the site. Again, I think this is an important part of this early history that's so often discussed, but every year there's more and more sites and more data being added, and we certainly didn't want to overlook the importance of a site like Ryan-Harley. Another thing that we don't want to overlook is the fact that this is the very first show after almost 6 years of doing 7AJ's Audio Journal that we've had an opportunity to discuss the Suwannee technocomplex. So many shows on Clovis and, Folsom and other things like that. But this is the first time we've had an opportunity to really focus on this rather enigmatic technocomplex that you don't hear so much about. So the consensus of scientific understanding surrounding Suwannee, what are we looking at? Do we have any solid dates? I know you mentioned different dating there and trying to, fit it into this timeline, but let's talk about any known dates for Suwannee and also the lithic style, how it differs from something, say, like a Redstone or a Cumberland or, other contemporary-ish time period styles. So let's talk about Suwannee. What do we know about it?
Yeah, totally. We don't know a lot about Suwannee. Fortunately, a radiocarbon date is forthcoming on the Suwannee site from none other than Paige Ladson. So recently, a series of dates were obtained on an in situ Suwannee point found at Paige Ladson. So we'll finally kind of get an answer there. But essentially at the moment, there's really just not a whole lot known about it, despite it probably being the most pervasive Paleoindian style in the lower Southeast, definitely in the lower Southeast, one of the more prevalent styles in the Southeast. Basically, it's a non-fluted lanceolate projectile type. So it tends to have kind of some basal thinning, and it tends to have earring on the base and a slightly concave base overall. There's been a series of sites that are widely cited on Suwannee, but all of them kind of stem from the same issue, that there is no discrete Suwannee component. So that really hinders us from understanding it. So some of the more famous ones are like Harney Flats, So Randy Daniel and Mike Weisenbaker, super famous site, one of Florida's preeminent Paleoindian sites. But one of the issues that Randy and Mike were running into excavating Harney Flats was that they were unable to stratigraphically separate the Suwannee and maybe some Simpson material from the later Bolin occupation at the site. So there was no real way of understanding what was Bolin and what was Suwannee. So there's similar sites throughout Florida, like Bolin Bluff, Hornsby Spring, Dunnigan's Old Mill, Norden. These are all well-known Suwannee localities, but they all kind of have the same problem where there's a later Bolin component, for lack of a better word, contaminating the Suwannee horizon. So we're not able to really say what's Bolin and what's Suwannee. I mean, there's a lot of debate over the age of the site. So some people think it's pre-Clovis. Some people think maybe it's a Clovis contemporary, and some people think it's post-Clovis. I tend to be in the post-Clovis camp. I think if you look at the geographic distribution of Suwannee points, it's kind of regionally specific to the lower southeastern coastal plains. So following PIDBA data, which can lead us astray sometimes, but is an awesome data set. There's a couple in South Carolina, there's a handful in Georgia, and then there's a lot in North Florida. And particularly around the Suwannee River area. So what this is telling us is that this group appears to be adapted to a certain region, and I think that's something that we expect more of middle Paleoindian groups that are kind of post-Clovis populations. I mean, if you look at other varieties like Cumberland, that's super specific to a certain region, like Redstone, that's very specific to a certain region. Folsom in the American West is kind of specific to a region, and then there's similar kind of Machad-Neponset points in the Northeast. So all these areas seem to be Clovis ancestors that are kind of marking out Corey that they're at least staying kind of broadly within. But I think that tells us that this is likely to be a middle Paleoindian variant. Obviously, Ryan-Harley was throwing a big wrench into that because there's the megafauna material in the same component as the Suwannee points. So that those questions I asked earlier, is this an earlier point style? Is megafauna surviving later? Or is there something else maybe geologically going on that we need to suss out further?
Yeah, well, we always love these paleo mysteries, as I call them. It's a wonderful way to research. But Morgan, I do have a couple questions here just for clarification. With the Suwannee lithic type, so these points, are we seeing any of the similar features that you would see with a Clovis? Or are we seeing like basal grinding? Are we seeing a more rounded point versus a sharper point like you would see on a redstone? Is there any indication from the lithic style itself what it could have potentially been used to hunt or process?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of variability in Suwannee, and I think there tends to be a pretty typical debate in kind of a lumper splitter scenario where some there's two also quite well known Suwannee experts or several. There's David Dolman and Jim Dunbar and Al Goodyear, and Randy Daniel all spent a lot of time looking at Suwannee points, and there's quite a bit of variability. I mean, just from Ryan-Harley, if you stack up the three projectile points, which are, in Jim's articles and my articles, if you just take a look at those, the first one found is this really long, auriculate, super sharp projectile point that's quite thin, quite wasted, and it is basally ground. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's this kind of shorter, stubbier variety. And then there's the more recent one that is a refit of two pieces is quite asymmetrical, so there is quite a bit of variability in the styling. And yeah, I think that if we had better control over some of these styles, we might be seeing regional differences within them. So we might be seeing like drainage basin specific areas. Some of the models that we look at for early hunter-gatherer movement in the Southeast, thanks to people like Randy and Al and Candy Hollenbach, are looking at kind of differences of people moving along drainages or among drainages. And I think it's pretty likely that in Florida, where you have these major drainages like the Suwannee River, the Chipola, the Osceola, the Santa Fe, you probably do have regionally adapted groups who may have some kind of variant in their style. whether or not there's some kind of temporal cline on those points. Maybe the longer, skinnier, pointier ones are earlier. The ones that look more like Clovis are earlier than the later. We really can't say. But I think it is kind of an enigmatic tradition, and that's kind of the state of things right now. There's really not a whole lot of known about it.
Yeah, so Suwannee not making it easy for anyone to nail that down. But eventually, I feel confident that we will get there. We'll figure it out sooner or later. It just might be later. But nonetheless, a very, very interesting type for sure. Now, there was something interesting, if I understood this correctly, that the Ryan-Harley site does not contain artifacts from other cultural periods. So, again, is that accurate? So we're not seeing any later, obviously not woodland stuff, pottery, anything like that, but we're not seeing any early or mid-archaic points or styles mixed in there. Is it completely sterile as far as the rest of the cultural periods go?
In the Suwannee component in Unit 3, there are no other diagnostic materials. So above Unit 3, there's a series of stacked peats where these stratigraphic components look like they start occurring around 8,000 years ago. And what this is showing us is the onset of the modern Wassissa River regime. So this is a landscape that's really not conducive to habitation anymore. It's the active flowing river. So you wouldn't have people like living in it. We have 2 wooden artifacts. One is actually really interesting. It's a wooden foreshaft base that's identical to, for example, a Clovis ivory or bone foreshaft, indicating that technology is not specific to Clovis and extends quite a bit. I think it's one of the older wooden artifacts around, and that's another interesting aspect of the Ryan-Harley site. And then there is a ceramic up high in the sequence, like one Deptford ceramic sherd that's far above the Suwannee horizon. But in the Suwannee horizon itself, there's nothing but Suwannee material. And that's been demonstrated in triplicate now. So Dunbar's excavations, my excavations, and Jesse Halligan's excavations have all shown that, there's nobody's been able to reject the hypothesis that it's nothing but Suwannee.
All of these little details, I think, really add to our understanding there. I want to talk about the screened sediment samples a little bit. Again, for those who may not have seen how underwater archaeology is conducted, talk a little bit about how that process works and then some of the discoveries that were made at the site.
Sure. That's one of the better parts about underwater archaeology for sure is basically all the stuff is water screenable very quickly on site, so it's not like we have to deal with, even if we have to deal with super dense clay down below, when it comes up to the surface, it's nice and freshly washed through our dredge. So we take 16th inch screen from basically everything. We retain as much of that material as possible. I am about 4 bags away from my beloved undergraduate students at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, finally processing all of the 2015 1/16th inch material. So we and the 2017 material. We had a lot of 16th inch material. I mean, that was similar to at Page Ladson. Actually, kind of a funny story was there's an old fishing cabin that we used to use, and it was owned by Eddie Green, who's just kind of this like legendary avocational archaeologist. Everybody's got their legendary avocational archaeologist. Florida has Eddie Green for sure. And the weight of the 16th inch material on Eddie's porch was so heavy that the porch detached from the house. And we had to like emergency move it all off. And his porch had to be braced back to the cabin. So this is a ton of, and it's waterlogged too, obviously. So it's way heavier than it normally would be. But that's super useful for us because it makes it just about as easy as possible to go through, even though we have tremendous quantities of it. So yeah, the 16th inch material is really what kind of tells the story because we've been able to identify some really sensitive ecological species in the 16th inch material. So a lot of muskrat and mink material that occasionally you might have a bone or two in the 1/4 inch screen, but it's definitely in the 16th inch material. So that's an animal that's extirpated in the region now. So it's not a mammoth or a mastodon, but it's one of those kinds of indicator species that's a lot more environmentally sensitive, and we see it present in the Suwannee component there. Some of the major discoveries from the 16th material, I would definitely say, were those smaller species that are extirpated. So we had some sensitive turtle species, some really sensitive environmental indicators of like mad tom catfish, that only inhabit certain sluggish kind of backwater areas that are telling us that there's probably a ponded environment nearby when the Suwannee people are occupying the area. So overall, the environment's telling us that, the river's probably not flowing consistently, maybe during periods of high water. But in our paleo environmental reconstruction, we were able to show that the campsite was really right adjacent to this deep depression that probably was a freshwater source. So maybe a reliable one at that. In addition to the faunal material, we have tips of bone needles and the stone beads that were mentioned previously. So we're up to 4 or 5 total stone beads from Ryan-Harley. So that's a really fascinating area to look at. And the 1/4-inch material came back with, the number that I listed earlier, about 3,000 specimens, where there were paleo llama, there were mammoth and mastodon remnants. There was a part of a ivory foreshaft fragment base that was recovered by Dunbar and colleagues, giant tortoise, Chelonia, extinct tortoise. Let's see what else. A bunch of unifacial, a pretty substantial unifacial toolkit. So that was useful in understanding the Ryan-Harley toolkit as a whole, because they have this very flexible, kind of adaptable toolkit where one of my more recent articles on the lithic technology of the site was looking at the microware. And it really does seem like these things are kind of used for everything. I mean, there's a little bit of grouping in between the bifaces and the unifaces on maybe different materials. But despite the variety in forms, like there are pretty clear adze-shaped materials, there's pretty clear classic side scraper materials. There's some things that look maybe like intentional blades, maybe an in-scraper on a blade, and then several bifaces. And all of these things are kind of quick, easy to produce. They're on pretty high quality raw material overall that appears to be local. So a lot of these things are kind of fitting into our idea of this group being overall pretty light on the land. If you have a flexible adaptive toolkit, that's because you're not really sure what the next month or 2 or 6 look like for you. So you have and maybe this is an area where they're gearing up for another logistical foray or a residential foray. That it looks like there is some raw material in the area. The hydric swamp nature of the area obscures a lot of stuff. There is pretty ubiquitous raw material in the Wasissa River, though, so I'm sure there's a quarry nearby that they're utilizing. Yeah, we were actually able to get a good idea of the bifacial reduction sequence. So a really neat thing was I did a refit study from the site, and we managed to come out with several refits, including an early stage Suwannee preform, the tip of which was from Jim's 1999 excavations that was found in C2, and the base I found in 2015. And that was actually one of the last artifacts that we refit, funnily enough. It was like the most obvious one. And then one day in the lab, I was just like, oh my gosh. I sent a picture to Jim and I was like, holy cow, look at this. So yeah, I mean, in addition to that, we had things like Jim identified a series of serpent vertebrae that were still articulated intact at the site. So these things are coming back to, the context of an underwater site. The fact that we have in situ bifacial refits, in situ animal remains, this is telling us that this is really like the site's been very minimally disturbed overall.
Yeah, and that's always a great thing. Again, so much information being retrieved from underneath the waters there in those rivers. As you're describing those things coming up, you really begin to get that picture of diet. You mentioned the stone beads. So we're seeing some sort of art form, something like a needle, maybe, again, referring back to tailored clothing or many other things that could be a part of that story. So even those smallest artifacts are really helping paint that picture. I think it's incredible, the work that you all are doing down there. So what is the future of Ryan-Harley in that surrounding area? Do you have any plans to return to the site or to continue to spread out through that region and look for other sites?
That's a good question. At the moment, no plans to return to Ryan-Harley, although I do think there's more information that could be obtained from future excavations there. At the moment, I do think we've answered most of what we can answer with the data set and the technology at hand. So I think it's there. I don't know if there's that much left of it. And that was a good lesson in my re-excavations of the Guest Mammoth site. Was Charles Hoffman intentionally left part of the excavation area unexcavated for future work. And had he not done that, I would have never been able to go back there and redo it. So I hope there's more to the component, but the last thing I'd want is to excavate the last of it and then nobody ever to be able to return. So yeah, I think we've kind of put a pin in Ryan-Harley. I do think it would be an interesting place for somebody to revisit, maybe in 10 or 15 years or so. As far as the surrounding region, we've continued work at Page Ladson and further out into the Gulf of Mexico now. So we've actually started working on sites kind of following the old Paleoindian River channel into Appalachia Bay, and working on a series of sites that Jim Dunbar and Michael Fox pioneered in the 90s and early 2000s. And part of that has been kind of with a series of projects funded by the Division of Historical Resources and the National Park Service, looking at impacts of storm damage and climate change on these resources. So I think that's definitely kind of the future, and it's such a working under freshwater in a river is already super challenging, and then you add salt water and the open Gulf to it, and it's just like it's just very, very hard. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of that lately, though, and recently we identified one of the only intact terrestrial surfaces so far found in the Gulf on an archaeological site, as well as a series of late Pleistocene, early Holocene artifacts adjacent to the Paleoindian River channel out there. So that sinkhole river channel system continues extensively as far out as the rest of the continental shelf. So, and I think that's where some amazing discoveries will be made. So that's kind of where the future is right now. My colleagues and I, Dr. Halligan's the lead PI of this project. We just received a grant from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to kind of reevaluate underwater archaeological policy and guidelines for how submerged landscapes are studied in the Gulf of Mexico, incorporating a lot more tribal involvement and a lot more policymakers into the ideas. As kind of offshore capital developments ramping up out there, we want to make sure that submerged landscape sites are protected on the same level as historic resources are. So that's where I think the future's moved. I think, but there's just limitless potential inland and in the shallow water Gulf environment for students and people wanting to do research projects. I know there's some really promising sites down in South Florida that I've always wanted to get down to that never have. Al Goodyear's told me for years about a series of sites around Tampa Bay that we've kind of always had on the list, and there are a series of Suwannee sites down lower in the state of Florida. So yeah, lots of places that my frenetic mind is always kind of thinking about, but hard to focus.
No, totally understandable. The mystery continues, but so does the research. All of that sounds incredible, and we'll certainly be looking forward to any future publications from you. Wrap up tonight on a good note of much is being discovered, but yet there's still a lot out there for the future of archaeology, especially in the state of Florida. So if anyone wants to follow along with your work, any social media or anything with your educational sites, how would they go about doing that, Dr. Smith?
Absolutely. We have a Facebook account with my university page. So the UTC Department of Social, Cultural, and Justice Studies is what we're housed under. Also, some of my colleagues and I have a nonprofit in the state of Florida called the Archaeological Research Cooperative that we're heavily involved in, that we bring students from Florida and kind of across the South and even other countries recently and kind of give them their first taste of underwater archaeology in the state. So we have a website there. That's where most of my work gets shared these days. I have an academia page and a ResearchGate page where all these publications are also available too.
Great. So everybody can follow along with all of the research and data that's going on out there. Again, we thank you, Morgan, for being here tonight. It was a real pleasure speaking with you. We're looking forward to future discussions, as I know you will continue to bring great things to the world of archaeology. So once again, thank you for being here tonight on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Yeah, thanks a ton, Jason.
Another fascinating conversation, guys. It just makes me want to get back out there on the road. It's been so long since I've been to an actual archaeology site, but you may have seen recently a new paper published by our friend Christopher Moore. He sent it to me the other day, and I was really excited to see this ongoing research. We won't talk about that right now. I want to save that for an entire future episode. And in fact, I see Jason sitting over there with his sock puppet, and he's making a peculiar gesture. This probably has something to do with what's going on in his mind right now. That one's always schemer. He's a schemer. Do you want to know how I got these scars? But in truth, yeah, I mean, I'd love to get back down there. Another thing, too, it is spring right here in the mountains, and maybe I'm just feeling sentimental since we have survived our latest plague or biblical scale disaster. You know, first it was COVID here in the mountains. We just had Hurricane Helene. We also just had fires. Okay, the biggest fire near my house was 4 minutes up the road, and it was a 2-acre fire. And thank goodness they got that put out. But I mean, my neighbors and I were all kind of like, okay, we're officially on alert. And so with all this madness ensuing in the world, it reminds me of right before COVID made landfall. We were literally getting the first actual diagnoses of COVID in the United States. And there were a few of them right here in North Carolina, too, because if you look at how that disease spread, I believe somebody came over to Washington, then they headed back to North Carolina after they were visiting someone at a rest home, and the virus began to spread. And so here we were, the 7Ages team. You guys remember this. We were having our breakfast at a Waffle House as we were reading the news about COVID, and that was, I mean, the big deal. And then we went and we worked on the archaeology site. The next morning, I think we went and we had breakfast at a Cracker Barrel, and then we went our separate ways. And by the time I got home, in the time between when we were at that restaurant that morning and by the time I had gotten back to Asheville, all the businesses in my town had closed except for the grocery store. I went to the store and all the groceries were gone. It was like a moment out of The Walking Dead.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember the Waffle House. I remember the second breakfast. You know, and I was thinking about what.
Well, hold on, but James, but do you remember the Alamo?
Well, I don't really remember the Alamo, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, I'm sure. Anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah, so White Pond. You were thinking about White Pond, though.
Yeah, I had White Pond on my mind the other day. But you know that same trip. That's the trip where I had taken the cheapest flight I could get. The time could not be changed. I couldn't change the flight. You guys dropped me off at the airport in I think it was in Charlotte, and I spent 8 hours waiting on my flight because like you guys had to leave and you couldn't wait, and everybody had to get out of there. So it was a pretty interesting trip. But I will say I am ready to get back out in the field. I'll travel all the way halfway across the country to go back out to White Pond and hang out with Chris Moore again.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, that was the last time we all three were actually out together in the field, and there has been so much calamity that has ensued since that time. So, I mean, every time I hear about another fire or a storm or a potential disease outbreak, you know, we've got bird flu concerns in the world right now. I keep thinking, our final refuge, we return to the White Pond Lodge. We face the witch, and we face our destinies. Anyway, guys, yeah, for the time being, why don't we just face the pub? Let's just all walk in this direction, single file if you like. Let's just pony up over here and have one more. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
As always, follow our work over at 7ages.org. You can find us on social media. Check out the Green Dragon Book Club and all the wonderful extra digging deeper content over there on our Patreon. Always something special coming to you from the folks here at the 7Ages Research Associates. On behalf of Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, Captain America, and yours truly, Micah Hanks, we bid you adieu, my friends, and we'll see you again somewhere out there in time when we return again here on the 7Ages Audio Journal.